Okay. On to item number 28, falconry. Aaron, are you going to lead us off on this?
President Sklar.
Please, Dave.
Chief Bass, Law Enforcement Division. You went to notice at the last meeting with the falconry regulation package with instruction to continue to work with the falconry community. And as we continue that outreach and engaged with that community, we came back to you today with a couple of recommendations for your consideration. Two of them, one will be relative to inspections, and the other is concerning what documents you have to have in the field. So the change is that you see before you from what we had before was there was a desire by the falconry community to have the licensee present when we did the inspection. And our language that we're putting before you today does cover that. So the licensee is present during the reasonable time on any day of the week, and of course some of the additional language where what we may inspect. But we've also, in agreements with the falconry community, included language that would cover if we had repeated resistance from a licensee who would not agree to meet us, and what action we may be able to take and how that would facilitate as we move forward through that with a refusal to allow inspection, what that may be inferred as, and what would happen if that continued to occur. Of course, we'd make reasonable attempts to try to make sure that that meeting occurred and get folks there at the same time. I think we've improved it with this recommendation. Relative to documents in the field, again, engaging with the falconry community, we came back and have decided at this point that our provision of what we'd like to put forward to you for your consideration is up on the screen. If you scroll down, Section 2, essentially what we're saying is it shall be unlawful for any person to engage in falconry in California unless they have in their immediate possession their valid original falconry license, a valid original hunting license, and any required stamps. That's it. We've really shortened it down from that first list that was noticed in the last meeting.
Terrific. Commissioners, any questions? And Director Bonham, please.
Yeah, so President, Commissioners, just by way of summary, in my judgment, Chief Bess and our staff, Stafford Lair, did what you asked at the last meeting. So I personally participated with them in a structured conversation with representatives from the California Hawking Club. And we also, after that meeting, had a subsequent phone conference call with additional individuals who are in the falconry community. In the California Hawking Club meeting, the club raised 4 issues with the department. First, further amendments to reduce their perceived burden about carrying papers in the field. And you just saw the regulatory amendment the chief proffers to deal with that. A lessened, well, I don't think it was a burden to begin with, but lessened burden for the falconer there. Then the club asked to discuss 2 additional items. One was related to removing permission to capture northern goshawks in Tahoe Basin, and another was to drop the draw system and move towards an annual quota system. Each of those, in our judgment, were outside the scope of what you asked us to take a look at, really hadn't been debated or discussed, weren't formed into the document and the review you had presented, but we've agreed they may have merit, therefore we should put them at the top of the discussion list, take them into the Wildlife Committee, sort that out, and maybe they're good ideas or bad ideas and roll it into the next rulemaking. And then the last item the club brought up was, I'm paraphrasing, require presence on the premise of the individual involved before we do an unannounced kind of inspection, and we've made amendments to deal with that.
Great.
You're going to also hear, I predict, in public comment about this so-called Fourth Amendment problem under the U.S. Constitution on reasonable searches and seizures. With the amendments the chief has made around inspections, I don't think that's a problem anymore for a couple of reasons. First, the language now says someone will be there. That's a big change. It's a compromise from where the department was. Second, at that moment in time, the individual can provide consent. Once you offer consent, you're no longer in an unreasonable search and seizure scenario. And lastly, if someone offers a hypothetical today that's the parade of horribles about what our wardens do, that's the precise reason why the Fourth Amendment's available for a citizen to bring a claim in those fact patterns. But we don't see those fact patterns emerging as much as they're suggested. And we'd say the backstop is you can always avail yourself of the Fourth Amendment. But the idea of having someone present, which is a concession we've made, and the opportunity to discuss and receive consent are very much improvements for those who are raising their concerns, in my judgment.
Great, thank you. Chief Best, you want to add something?
Yes, just also to say, you know, these are inspections. They're not searches, specifically under the law. And in addition to that, this was always from what we'd heard from the community about falconers' private residences, their homes, not the place where, you know, the vast majority of falconers keep their birds and their mews outside. Most are not inside the residence, so that's what that conversation was revolving around, not just the general inspection that might occur on the property.
Terrific. Please.
Just a quick question, Director Bonham. What were the two items that are going to move to WRC?
Either Chief Best or I'm sure Mr. Gaines may mention it. The first that we're going to suggest you take up in further discussion in this committee would be the club offered the idea that you just go ahead and remove the permission to capture northern goshawks in the Tahoe Basin. My sense is they just don't believe enough people are doing that or want to do that. And then second, shifting the whole approach from a draw system to an annual quota system.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Unless there are any other questions, we'll invite the speakers up. Please call the names, Karen.
Eric Ariyoshi, Troy Morris, and Bill Gaines.
And while they're coming up, President Sklar, if I may, real quickly, the department had separately and previously provided some suggested edits to the language. It was not with respect to addressing concerns by the falconers, but there were some comments raised by OAL in their review, and so there were some minor edits to that also that the department had shared. So there's several cumulative proposed amendments. Those are very minor edits.
Okay, terrific. And a reminder, this is a discussion hearing. We'll talk about adoption at our December meeting. Please come on up.
Good morning. My name's Troy Morris. I represent American Falconry Conservancy. We're here to discuss the Fourth Amendment issues of these inspections. And first, I'd like to thank the department for conceding on what a person needs to carry during the sport of falconry. I think what you've suggested is perfectly reasonable, and we're fine with that. We did question whether the legislatures have enacted a law that authorizes law enforcement to come and search the premises of citizens to search their property and papers with no probable cause and no search warrant. And if that is in the law, then we'd ask the department, we have continued to ask the department, department's attorneys, the commission's attorneys, what that law is. We did have a meeting with Director Bonham and staff, and we thank you for that. We expressed our concerns. The meeting was somewhat fruitless since we weren't given the answer to the legal authority of the inspections or searches. And we find it impossible for anyone to articulate whether these warrantless inspections are compatible with the law when no one can cite the statute. I mean, what's reasonable under the law if we don't know what the law is, and we've repeatedly asked what that law is, and we're not getting an answer for that. And we deserve that. The law requires that when you're making regulation that you state the statutory authority, and we really want to know what that is. This morning, Director Bonham talked about the Fourth Amendment and our right to plead the Fourth Amendment during one of these inspections, and I appreciate that, the direction we're going in. I don't exactly know what that means. If a police officer comes to my home and says he wants to inspect my property because there might be a crime, we all know that we can refuse or ask for a search warrant. I don't know what the regulatory regime that we're talking about now really entails, as Director Bonham had just discussed. So we're a little bit confused in that regard. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do you want to respond to that, Director?
I appreciate Mr. Morris's questions. He is correct that they've been asking them repeatedly. I'd remind everyone that on page 12 of the ISOR is a specific section that's required by administrative rulemaking law. It's called Authority and Reference Sections from Fish and Game Code for Regulation. It lists over a dozen authorities in the code for promulgating these regulations. On the question of inspections, these are not searches, they're inspections. We have agreed to make an important change. Our prior approach we offered was unannounced. No one was required to be there. We are now putting in the regulatory text a specific provision that these inspections occur when the licensee is present during a reasonable time of the day and on any day of the week.
Okay.
That individual presumably can refuse, at which point those individuals are taking the process down a particular pathway. But we've made an amendment responsive to the concern we've heard lodged.
Okay, thank you.
So.
Thank you.
Good morning, Commission Department. First, I'd like to thank Commissioner Bonham Director Bonham for the call and the dialogue in terms of working with us. I think it has been a very positive.
Can you state your name for the record?
Yeah, my
please?
name is Eric Ariyoshi. I spoke at the last Game Commission meeting as well, and I've been involved in falconry since a child. My biggest concern with the proposed falconry regulations remains the issue on searches. On this topic, the allowable inspections as currently outlined constitute warrantless searches in conflict with the Fourth Amendment. The proposed regulations give authority to allow armed officers to enter the premises of private citizens at any reasonable hour without a warrant or any form of due process. I'd like to pause here and point out that while these searches are constantly being referred to as quote-unquote administrative inspections, there's nothing administrative about them. I am not aware of any other sportsman's group where law enforcement officers are allowed into private residences without a warrant. In Title 13 of the California Code of Civil Procedure, the state legislature has provided the means for administrative inspections, and the published regulations do not meet these standards. Inspection warrants are only available when inspection relates to, quote, building, fire, safety, plumbing, electrical, health, labor, zoning, unquote, none of which are remotely applicable to the practice of falconry by a private citizen. Additionally, there's no case law to support law enforcement to enter the sanctity of one's home without a warrant. Contrary to the testimony of Anna Malcolm at the last meeting, established case law clearly specifies that searches are limited to the field. This is very clear in Beachart versus Fish and Game. In this case, the judge acknowledged the authority of wardens to patrol public and private lands and to perform 10-12 field stops. However, the same judge stated that this authority did not extend to other locales, such as one's home. In fact, he said if it did, it would be, and this is a quote, a threat to the citizen's personal security. Finally, contrary to previous testimony, falconry does not, under any standard, meet the definition of a highly regulated industry. I would challenge anybody in this room to argue otherwise. So thank you for this diligence. I'd just like to add one thing in terms of some comments. As a practicing falconer with decades of experience, I can say that the assertion that a vast majority of raptors are held in mews is not correct. In fact, the gold standard for housing small raptors is actually to house them indoors where you can control temperatures. So I would say that is not an accurate statement. Thank you for your diligence and your attention on this matter.
Thank you. Mr. Gaines.
President Sklar, Director Bonham, Commissioners, Department, and Commission staff. My name is Bill Gaines, and on this item, I am speaking on behalf of the Board of Directors of the California Hawking Club. It's the largest falconry organization in California and the only falconry organization with a paid membership. For the past 4 or 5 years now, the California Hawking Club has worked diligently with the Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Commission on trying to shape the California's falconry regulations, which, as you know, were passed down to the state by the Federal Fish and Wildlife Service back in, I believe it was 2013. Taken many, many hours, not only of our time, but many, many hours of the department's time, and I personally wanted to thank the department and their staff for taking the time to meet with us numerous times over those years, as well as the Commission and their staff, who we've met with several times as well. We started out with many, many issues of concern within the proposed falconry regs. With the help of the Commission, we've narrowed those down to the top 4 priority. And after the August meeting, I believe we chiseled it down to the final 2, that being documentation and the unannounced inspections. Since the August meeting, we did meet personally with Chief Best as well as Director Bonham and some of his other staff to talk about these issues face-to-face. Followed that with some conference calls. And the language that Chief Best has brought forward to the Commission for consideration today is language that was hard to get to, but we are very, very pleased to support it. And again, we totally appreciate the department's willingness to work with on this and to seek reasonable consensus resolution. We are pleased to support the language that they're bringing forward today on documentation in the field and the unannounced inspections. And on behalf of the president of the California Hawking Club, Glenn Stewart, who is out in the field working on raptors right now in Idaho, he sent me a note and he wanted me to say that he wishes he could have been here personally, but since he can't, he wanted me to read a short quote that he says, "I am very grateful to the Commission for their attention to and patience with our issues, and that I especially appreciate Chief David Best's thoughtful work leading to a fair resolution." So, and I agree with that as well. As Director Bonham mentioned, we do have a couple more issues that we need to talk about, one being the northern goshawk, another one being the lottery system for the prairie falcon. We're pleased that the department is willing to kick those over to the WRC and give those some attention in the coming months. We look forward to working with the department and the Commission on those 2 items, along with Aaron and the WRC as well. And I'm confident that we'll reach fair resolution on those as well. So again, thank you much to the Commission. Thank you much to the department for the time put into this issue. And I believe that we've reached solid consensus, and we're pleased to support what's being brought forward by the department today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gaines. Any commissioner comments or questions? I would just say that, I want to reiterate the thanks to the department, to Chief Best, to Director Bonham. I don't recall the name of the staff member who been working on this for years. Maybe you can remind me. Carrie Battistone.
Carrie Battistone on the science side, and Assistant Chief Mark Jeter on law enforcement.
So give them our thanks as well. I think that I'm not a lawyer, and I don't want to get into a long dissertation on the Fourth Amendment, but like many of the amendments to the Constitution, the first 10, it's a balancing act. These are wild animals that are the property of the state, and when individuals are granted the right, the privilege, not the right to possess them, there's a balancing act. I think that the staff, the community has worked very hard to nail down a reasonable and the Constitution says against unreasonable search and seizure. And so I think this is very reasonable, and I'm proud of the effort that's been made to not just go with what was originally written, but to narrow this down and fine-tune it, and I appreciate the support of the broad community. With that, we have no action today. It's just discussion. We're going to have it again on the agenda in December for possible adoption. So thank you, everyone. Moving on to